All right, thank you, everyone. So these and the next few talks are going to be pretty quick. These are 10 minutes. So I'm going to just assume everyone in this room knows what a DAO is and knows the basics. If you don't, the basics are it's a thing on chain that governs what you do on chain, whether that's user funds or protocol funds. And more of them are coming online, so we have to deal with them. Specifically, we are seeing them come out a lot when it comes to governing both DeFi protocols, which has been very popular for governing Aave, Compound. It even does some treasury management for Uniswap, among many other DAOs. And then also especially L2 rollups. Many of you have probably heard of this whole thing called stage 1 or bust. Vitalik's not going to call anything a rollup unless it's stage 1. And typically that involves some level of decentralization, which can typically be done through a DAO. That's not the only path, but that's one major one. We have major rollups such as Arbitrum, ZK Sync, and many others now moving towards a DAO-governed model for the protocol and how it manages upgrades, in addition to a lot of treasury funds that can be many millions, if not billions of dollars. So we have to deal with these, and there's likely going to be more DAOs in the future. But they add a lot of complexity. This is no longer just one team trying to figure out how to deploy code securely, which, given a lot of the talks we've seen today, are already very challenging. Now we have to deal with the fact that this permissionless governance environment itself has increased the attack surface, and we have to be very careful about how we manage it while still keeping some level of decentralization or some level of governance participation, whatever the actual goal is. This is not a theoretical risk. We've already seen Beanstalk, Tornado Cash, and the Compound DAO suffer some sort of impact from malicious proposals, anywhere from just having a misconfiguration that causes temporary downtime to having the entire protocol ultimately become compromised with funds stolen through upgradable contracts. So this is a very real threat. It's something we've already suffered losses from. And if we want to actually secure the future of Ethereum, if we're going to actually govern all these rollups through DAOs or something like a DAO, then we're going to have to make sure that we're taking this very seriously. So that's why we're talking to talk about DAO proposals and how you should protect against them. So I'm just going to start up front with, here's the proposal lifecycle. Very simply put, I'm going to divide it into 4 categories that you can apply pretty broadly to any DAO, no matter what framework you're using. Eventually, you're going to start with the creation process. You have an idea for a proposal, and you're going to implement it. This could be just a simple function that's going to allocate treasury funds to some account or multi-sig that's doing a grant committee or something like that. It could be something as complex as doing a whole smart contract upgrade and changing the way the protocol works, the way the governor contract itself works, which actually involves new code and Solidity code that might have to go through a rigorous development process and testing and things like that. So we say that the creation process isn't going to end when you've actually you finished defining the requirements, you've hopefully identified some of those potential risks as you implement the code, and you've eventually developed some sort of proposal payload that you're then going to want to be submitting on-chain to the DAO. Before you actually submit that to the DAO, you should ideally have a validation process, which means that you're going to go through some sort of external review, and in the case of new code, an audit, that's going to end with validating that proposal once it's going to be submitted on chain. And it's really important that not only are we auditing any code changes, if it's an upgradable smart contract, even if it's a small little change, even a small little change can potentially cause a massive impact on a protocol. So everything and all of its impact should be updated or audited. And then you should be testing it, ideally with live mainnet simulations. I'll talk about why in a second, but not just testing it in an isolated environment, but doing it based on the live code you're deploying it to, because the DAO and the protocol itself are live on chain, and you don't want to be making any incorrect assumptions about how that code is going to operate in production. And ideally, you've then checked the proposal submitted on chain, which is to say, even once you've submitted on chain, you want to do some additional checks. Is this actually the same payload we were looking at previously? Were there any issues or changes introduced during the deployment? And so you want to have some general validation even once it's been submitted on chain, ideally in the review phase. Finally, the approval stage. This is when everyone's actually going to show up and vote. In many cases, this is token holders showing up to vote. There could be multiple stages. It could be, you could have some snapshot beforehand. You could have a multi-sig that also has to provide additional approval checks in addition to the token holder vote. So it could be a simple vote. It could be multiple checks. But in any case, what you're doing in this case is, ideally, you're publishing everything you did in the validation stage to show, hey, it's been audited. Hey, we've actually simulated it. Hey, we've done testing. We've had several other people sign off on it. Ideally, all of the QA processes have actually been published for people to verify on their own. You also need to make sure the decision makers are informed. There's actually been some communication to token holders so that they know to show up to vote. And then finally, you're ideally monitoring activity on chain to watch how the vote is progressing, how's the vote going, do we anticipate any issues with the proposal as it moves through the protocol or the DAO. And then finally, execution. Once you've gotten approval, it's officially been approved, there's usually some sort of period. It can be executed immediately, but in a lot of cases and in best practices, you have a time lock, so there's several days where it's sitting before execution. And during that time, you should be watching that timeline, watching for the exact time where that execution is going to occur, so that there's a team prepared to ensure that it goes smoothly and respond to any issues. So you should have an instant response and recovery plan in place if something goes wrong. And then, of course, you should be doing some health checks after you've executed it to be sure, yes, the impact has, in fact, done what we expected it to, and there's no adverse effects that we have to respond to. So in practice, let's talk a bit about what we've learned working on Compound, because the OpenZeppelin team has been doing security audits and security work for the Compound DAO for several years now. Working as its primary security partner, I've been pretty involved at the high level. A lot of the auditors that we have actually here today have also been working on that. And just so you know, the process is pretty simple. You create a proposal, it sits there for 2 days, you vote for 3 days, it either succeeds or it fails, and then you have a time lock that's queued in for 2 days. And so these are the timelines in which we're typically working. So the first incident that I want to talk about is Proposal 117, which is a CETH price incident. This occurred on August 30th, 2022, when we're basically upgrading the UAV system. This was basically a system that was comparing Uniswap prices to Chainlink prices that needed to be upgraded from Uniswap v2 to Uniswap v3. And the problem is, ultimately, there was a misconfiguration where even though it worked with ERC20 tokens, there was actually a native ETH function or market in Compound v2. And this Oracle didn't actually know how to cooperate with that market appropriately. It was all the testing was only done with the ERC20 market. And this caused a denial of service where the price could not be updated and the market was effectively frozen because every call to that market would fail when it called the Oracle. And that really sucked. Luckily, we were able to get a fixed proposal up very quickly and then wait 7 days, going through the governance process, to get it through. And luckily, the prices didn't go down in such a way that would have caused major issues. So frankly, very lucky. And what ultimately went wrong was the validation process. And I think this is probably one of the best case studies to show that audits alone are not going to ensure safety, because 3 independent audits from reputable firms were done on this code. And the reason that none of these auditors caught it is because the bug wasn't in the code, it was in the configuration and how it would work with the on-chain markets. The code made an assumption in the interface about it only needing to interact with ERC20, not the native Ether market, and so none of the auditors were able to catch it because it was not in scope. And so ultimately, what would have caught this is if you did a mainnet simulation, it would have obviously shown what honestly seemed like an obvious bug in retrospect, that this market would fail and you would not be able to actually do Oracle calls. So what was changed? A contribution policy was then put in place that said anytime you're doing a code upgrade, you have to publish a mainnet simulation before you even put it through a vote. If there is no mainnet simulation that has been conducted, that people can verify, that everyone should basically automatically vote no, because that should be a critical stage in the process. And then finally, in addition to requiring the developers to be doing that step, OpenZeppelin, not as a security partner, we're not just doing audits now, but we're also doing on-chain validation of that proposal and doing our own testings in a best case scenario. Or in a best case effort, I should say, because at the end of the day, we still want developers to have the ownership of making sure the code is secure, while the security partners or security auditors are doing their best to validate that and ensure that it's the case. The next incident is probably something that you have heard about recently if you're following any of the governance drama, which was the Humpy governance manipulation attempt. So on July 28th, 2024, a fellow named Humpty, you can read more about him online, he's got a history with DAOs. He was able to accumulate enough comp over time and spread them amongst many different accounts. So it didn't look like this person had as much voting power as they did, in order to then cast all their votes last minute to pass an unpopular proposal that would have given them a large portion of the Compound treasury, and through that, potentially control of the DAO itself, because it is a voting token. And so this proposal was passed. You can see the timeline up there that shows that, like, if you can see the vote, like, it's clearly, on the red line, like, well into, like, not passing. And then suddenly you just see this in the last hour, literally like Saturday midnight, all these votes start coming in from all these random accounts that, in hindsight, are obviously all controlled by Humpty, that was able to pass a proposal last minute. And so this is a problem, because ultimately, even though you could say, well, this is technically following the rules of governance, it's actually really bad for governance for someone to be able to do this, because if all the token holders were aware this person had this much voting power, more people would have showed up to vote, and it wouldn't have passed. So what was changed? A proposal guardian multisig was put in place to ensure that in specific cases like this, there's someone who has a check on token holders that can actually veto proposals in cases where some community rule was violated. There's also an upgrade to introduce quorum protection. And there is a delegate program that is now trying to assign more comp to active delegates that are aligned with the community. I'm almost out of time, so I'm just going to run through this really quick. This is ultimately the takeaways I want you to have, is documenting a proposal lifecycle, closing any QA gaps, especially between the audit and then what you're actually submitting on chain, so that you know what you're submitting on chain is still matching the audit. Monitoring all your proposals on chain and looking for any activity, including suspicious activity that might be coming from token holders, as well as any issues that might lead to the proposal execution going poorly. And then having checks on permissionless voting systems, because ultimately these are permissionless systems, so that means they have very large attack surfaces, and you should consider having multisigs or other things that have a check against them. And so the takeaway is, ultimately, without security, these DAOs are going to be more vulnerable to the very risks they are intended to avoid, which is to have people that are able to then introduce things that affect user funds. And so to protect DAOs, we need to have security safeguards embedded into the entire governance process, both on-chain and off-chain. We can't just rely on the code alone. We also have to have the people that are running these DAOs and participating in them to take security seriously and implement it in everything they do. So thank you for your time, and on to the next person.